everyone, welcome to Painting Crafty. And today I'm a part of a YouTube collaboration with a bunch of friends, and the theme today is Christmas in July. I'm going to show you how I painted this vintage style snow angel on a vintage ironing board. If I find these surfaces at my local thrift store, they usually come home with me, especially if they're a reasonable price. This makes a great little accent piece for your front porch or standing in a corner in your home. Well, let's get started. I can't wait to show you how I created her, and hopefully I'll inspire you to take a second look when you see these vintage ironing boards at your local thrift stores. I love the size of these vintage ironing boards. This one happens to be 4 feet long and 11.5 inches wide. Now this one had an unusual situation. There was a paper top on it, but it was easily removed with my paint scraper. I did add a little bit of water, but it all came off very easily. Once I had the paper top off, I gave it plenty of time to dry and then took some 220 grit paper and gave it a quick sand. Because I had used water on the top, it does raise the grain. Plus, this is just kind of a rough sawn board, so I just smoothed out some areas, but it didn't take much work and it was all ready to paint. The next step I wanted to do was add more of a wooden tone to this background. I still wanted some of the wood to show, so I wanted a nice warm feeling to it. So I chose to use my Liquitex matte medium, some acrylic paint, and a little bit of water. And I was able to go ahead and spread that out with a chip brush and then wipe it off with a paper towel. It acted kind of like a stain to my piece, but because it was water-based, the and a trace and paint option. There's going to be a variety of sizes there, so go ahead and check out the link down inside of the description box if you would like to go ahead and paint this snow angel. I'm going to be using some Deco Art colors to go ahead and do the base coat painting in. This is just basically a color book style. I'm just coloring in those areas. For the white part of my snow gal, I'm going to be making her warm white. For her jacket, I'm going to be using Sea Breeze. And for her scarf area, it's going to be a little bit of mixture of some of those colors plus a little bit of Bahama Blue. Each of these layers are going to take a couple coats to be able to fill it in, and once they were dry, I went ahead and started the process of drawing her face. I know it's a little hard to see, but the eyes that I drew were these very sweet, where you have kind of a smile face shape at the top and then a sad face shape at the bottom, and then the commas on each side to make the outside of the eyes, and then the dark pupil in the inside. It's a really sweet design to make eyes in, and I can't wait to show you what it looks like once it's all painted. Her nose was just a wiggly little carrot, and then I just did a few little kohl marks for her smile. Then I continued on with the drawing process, adding her scarf, that cute little bunny, and those birds down at the bottom with the big long legs. I love to draw that style of bird. I do add some arms on her as well, so she can hold that bunny, so she has a little bit of little extra arms on each side. Drawing is definitely my thing. I have always loved to draw. I do have a sketchbook membership inside of my Ko-fi page as well. Any of the paintings that I do on my YouTube channel, you can join the sketchbook membership and get the tracers for all of them. It's very reasonably priced, easy to join, and I'd love to have more creative friends join me over there. I know not everyone likes to draw, so I can do that part, and then you can go ahead and trace and paint. For the scarf, I went ahead and I base coated it in the warm white color, and then while my brush was still dirty with the white paint, I picked up a little bit of the Sea Breeze and a little bit of the color Bahama Blue and mixed those colors together as I was painting the scarf area. That just is going to add a lot more dimension to that scarf. For her wings, I decided I wanted to paint them in a pine bough style. So I'm using a round brush in the number 6 size with a nice pointy tip, and I created the branches first, and then I went ahead and brushed in the pine boughs. And I used a variety of colors as well for this. I used Hauser green in medium and light, and a little bit of a darker forest color green as well. And it also looks great if you pick up a little bit of the Sea Breeze or the Bahama Blue and go ahead and add just a tiny bit to those boughs. It just brings your picture all together. To create the shadows around my snowman's face, I use a water floating technique using a 1/2 inch angle brush. The color I chose to use was cocoa. It's a nice shade, it's a light shade, so she doesn't look overly dirty, but she does have a beautiful little shade around her face. The water floating technique is one I like to use, and I'll explain it a little bit more as I go along. I was going to be giving this snow gal blue eyes, and I chose the color turquoise blue for the blue part, and for the centers I used lamp black. When painting these small little areas, it's always nice to have a round brush to do them with a nice pointy tip. It helps get the color exactly where you want it. A good little tip is if you do have some color that goes in an area where you don't want it, is to use a Q-tip. Dip it in water, and then you can slightly rub out those areas where you don't want your paint. It's a great little eraser when it comes to acrylic paint. The next area I'm going to be adding that watercolor float is down on her scarf, and I'm going to be using the turquoise blue that I painted her eyes. That's the color I'm going to use on her scarf. Let's talk a little bit more about that floating or watercolor floating look. I'm dipping my brush into my clean water, taking it out of my water bowl, and then I touch it on a paper towel till I see the shine gone. Then all I do is dip the edge of my angle brush into the paint a little bit, and then I rub it back and forth on my palette. And what that does is it goes ahead and it makes that paint go from one end of the paintbrush to the other. So when you stroke it down, you're going to have the end where the paint is be the darkest, and then it gets that gradual watercolor float all the way across. It's a great little technique to use. It does take a little bit of practice, but it's well worth practicing. The greens I chose for her mittens were the same colors that I used for the pine boughs. The shadow color that I used around the outside of her jacket is called Admiral Blue, and that's an apple barrel paint. It's a beautiful shade of blue, and it looks great over top of that sea breeze color. I'm going to be mostly focusing around the outside of her body and any place in the middle where there might be a shadow. So around her cuffs, around her mittens, and all the way around her jacket. I decided I wanted a gray bunny, so I used the color slate gray, and I basically just do a color book style painting in this area. I go ahead and paint the form out exactly how it's drawn, and I'll come in and add the details a little bit later. The colors I used to create the cuffs on my snow gal were cocoa, burnt sienna, and burnt umber. I wanted this to have a fur texture, so I used a flat brush that has been well loved and well used. It had more of a scruffy little texture to it. And I tapped those colors, mixing them as I go. So up and down motion with that scruffy old brush, that's going to help create that fur texture. To help the trim stand out on her jacket, I decided to paint it the same way I did the scarf. So I'm using a little bit of the Snow White, some Sea Breeze, and a little bit of Bahama Blue, and mixing my colors as I go. Because I am painting on that turquoise color, I do need to check my colors to see if they're flattening, and that green was kind of flattening out. So I decided to brighten it back up by adding a little bit more of the light Hauser green and some of the other color of the medium green, and mixing them as I go. And here you can see me using another coat of the gray. This time I added a little bit more white to it to lighten that bunny up just a little bit. I didn't want it to be too dark of the base coat color. Now to add a few more finishing details to her face, I decided to make a twig style halo for her since I had the pine boughs for her wings. I used my round brush and I dip it into the browns that I'd already used for her cuffs. That way my picture all kind of goes together. I'm using similar colors. For her nose, I base coated it in bright orange. Oranges are very translucent, so it's going to take a couple layers of paint to cover up her little cute nose. I used the color Lamp Black to create the little stones for her smile. Again, I'm using my round brush with that nice pointy tip. Once the sticks were dry, I used the same greens that I had used on the pine boughs to create some leaves for the halo. I'm just creating little football style leaves where it's got a point on each side and a little belly in the middle. These are pretty simple leaves. You could make them pointed, you could make them round, however you want to add in a few more leaves. I put the leaves on first so that I can lay the flowers on the top, and that's going to give it a nice layered look in the end. I used 2 shades of red to create my flowers. Tuscan Red was the bright red, and Heritage Brick was the darker color. I use the same dirty brush technique where I'm just picking up the colors as I go, not rinsing my brush out in between my strokes. I'm creating little comma strokes, irregular circle size flowers. I'm also making sure that some of them touch so they don't have just this floated look of individual flowers of a pattern. So I want some of my flowers to overlap to have that nice layered look of flowers. Once I had the flowers painted in, I decided to add a few more filler areas, and the pine bough look is what I wanted to create. So I'm still using the same greens, but I'm making some of those longer pine needle looks inside of there. I'm using my little round brush to create these little simple strokes. Now to add a little bit more character to those mittens, I'm going to be adding that color float shadow around each mitten. I'm using the color forest green to add a nice deep shadow and give those mittens a lot more contour by adding that darker line there. I've already painted my birds that color of the Tuscan red and the heritage brick color. It's flattened out quite a bit, so now I'm going back in and adding another layer of that color. I am going to be adding a brighter shade of red in the end, so this is just basically the color book style of painting using a dirty brush and mixing my colors as I go. Now I want to go back in and add a few more details to her eyes. I'm going to be using that Admiral Blue color and doing some color floats on each side of the eye. I'm using a very small angle brush, a 1/4 inch angle brush, and I'm floating that darker blue color around her eyes. It just really does bring them to life. Again, you can use that Q-tip trick again. If you get a little bit too much of that water color float past your eyes, use a Q-tip to erase that color. I'm going to create a color float around inside of the orange of her nose, and I'm going to be using that bright orange and mixing a little bit of the burnt sienna color into it, just to deepen and darken that orange color. I float it all the way around on the inside of that nose using that 1/4 inch brush. I switch back to my 1/2 inch angle brush and I do some more color floating of the cocoa color underneath her nose. And I do it around the little coal pieces to add just a shadow on one side of each of those little coal pieces. I'm hoping you can really tell what a difference just a little bit of paint makes in adding the shadows to her face and adding the little details. Here I'm adding that shadow line underneath her eye, and I'm going to switch back to my 1/4 inch brush and add a few little shadows on each side of her eye just to set them back into her head, and they won't look like they're just sitting on the very top. She's looking pretty cute. I love these little details. For her nose, I added a little bit more dark shadows in the inside to create those little carrot lines. I check my flowers to see how they are dried, and I add another layer of the heritage brick and the Tuscan red. To add a highlight to her eye, I'm going to be color floating the color sky blue using my 1/4 inch brush. I want the highlight to be on the right side of each of the dark part of her eye. It may look a little bright now, but it'll dry down and flatten as it dries. Now to add a nice pop of red, I'm going to be using the color Pyrrole Red in the Golden Fluids. It's one of my favorite ways to add a bright pop of red. I'm using the same dirty brush technique, mixing the Heritage Brick and the Tuscan Red along with my Pyrrole Red, just to add that brilliance to those flowers. I also add the same look down on my birds. You can really see how that Pyrrole Red really brings these birds to life. Having that darker color first and then adding the Pyrrole Red on top adds for a special brightness of red. Now that I had the majority of her face finished, I turned my attention to the rabbit. I wanted to add a watercolor float to him, so I took some of the black that I had used and mixed it with the gray to create a watercolor float around my rabbit. Added a few fringes to the end of my scarf using that Admiral Blue mixed with a little bit of Sea Breeze and Bahama Blue. To add the sparkle to her eyes, I was going to be using my stylist and some bright white paint. I add one little dot, and then I add a dip dot drag. So I dot my paint and then drag it to make a little tiny comma stroke. If you do them on the right side of the one eye, you have to do them on the right side of the other eye. I take that little stylus and I add one little bright white on each of the kohl. I add a few little dip dot drags on her nose as well. To add the pink details to my rabbit, I was going to be using cactus flower. I had first base coated in his nose and the inside of his ear using warm white, and now I'm brushing on a layer of the cactus flower. This color is also going to be the blush color that I use for the cheeks of each the rabbit and my snow gal. To create the eye for my rabbit, I used the end of my paintbrush and dipped it into the black paint and added a black dot for his eye. For the buttons, I had created and drew some wonky little stars for the front. I'm using the color burnt umber to base coat them in. I wanted that same rusty kind of brown feeling that the cuffs were done in. Now it's time to add a few of those blush cheek elements to the snow gal and the bunny. I'm using a scruffy brush and I had dabbed it into the color cactus flower, rubbed it off onto my hand till it's really dry, and then I'm just doing a little brush round circle motions to create those blush cheek looks for my snow gal and my rabbit. Now to add a few more highlights that go all over the body, some on the rabbit, on the mittens, and add a little bit more interest, I took a larger brush, a scruffier brush, and put it into that color, Spa Blue, did a very much a dry brush look. This just adds a little bit of highlight that's very soft. I add it to the center of my mittens, the center of the body of the rabbit, and I add it kind of all over randomly on her jacket. This dry brushing technique is just a great way to add a subtle highlight to your things. Just have to make sure you get enough rubbed off before you put your brush down so you don't get blotches of color. For the little birdie beaks, I base coated them first in warm white and then put a little tap of golden paint on there, and then the orange that I had used for the carrot, I blended that on at the same time. To create the little bird eyes, I used the end of my paintbrush again, tapped it into some black paint, and gave them a dot eye. For my stars, I had done 2 layers of burnt umber. To add a little bit more rusty look to them, I took some burnt sienna and put a coat of burnt sienna over the top. Those heavy black dots take a little bit of time to dry, so you need to wait till they're completely dry, and then you can add the sparkle to their eyes using bright white and the stylus tool. To fill in the bottom space, I used a bright white for my snow, added some texture back and forth, even took my palette knife and scraped it back and forth to bring out some of the wood. I was going to be adding some shadows to that area as well. I went back up and checked my boughs to see how the paint had dried there. I went in with some of the forest green color and a little bit of the other lighter colors and just layered up my colors even just a little bit more. I was going to be using a Posca pen in the color white to be able to do the lettering in. I have found in the past that if you do the priming and the pumping on a separate piece of paper, and then when you do your lettering, just use an even pressure, and that helps so you don't get those blotches of paint when you're using your paint marker. I did want a few heavy dashes of white snow, so I used my Posca pen, primed it off to the side, and then dashed some paint on the top. I was going to be using the Posca pen and the black to create the legs. I did the same thing, primed and pumped it off to the side, and then just used even pressure when I was drawing my legs. Now that I have pretty much all of the painting done, it's time to add the line work. And one of my favorite ways to add lashes and detail to the eyes is with the Kimberly 9XXB pencil. It's a very soft pencil, almost gives you a charcoal quality. I love to add little scribbly bits with this. I'm holding my pencil loose to create loose line work. I'm not wanting to just do a color book tracing around everything. I'm just adding the line work here and there, keeping very loose lines. This is just very optional, but this is the way I like to create. The technique and the painting style that I already have done would basically be finished at this stage, but now the way I like to paint is I love to add additional line work using line mark and mark making tools. And the Kimberly 9XXB is one of my favorite ways to do it. You can see how I'm going past my items, not necessarily following all the lines. I created little scribbly bits inside of his cuffs to add even a little bit more dimension. I'm going around the stars, but not tracing exact. I'm following around the fabric, but not exactly, and stopping and starting and twisting and pulling my pencil. I do the same thing for the little birds. I wanted to say a special thank you to Annie for putting today's collaboration together. You're going to find the link to her channel inside of the description box, as well as a playlist of all the other videos that everyone has contributed for today's Christmas in July. Definitely take some time, click that playlist. I'm sure you're going to be inspired to create something fun for your upcoming Christmas holidays. The next layer I like to add is little scribbly bits of white, and the pencil I like to use is actually a China marker. Sharpie makes them. They're very inexpensive, easy to find tools. They're a great way to add almost a color crayon line work on the very top. The next tool I'm going to be using is the Stabilo woody pencils. They were actually designed for children, but mixed media artists love to use these because they are a water-soluble pencil. You can put them on and then you're going to soften them with water. I add some line detail, all long lines, down on the coat and add a little bit of extra texture to the fabric areas. By creating the texture using the Woody Stabilo pencil, I can come back in with a water, just plain water, and a brush and soften the colors back. And it adds almost kind of a texture of a color crayon. You'll still see the line, but it's going to soften to almost a watercolor quality over the top. It makes very interesting lines, and it's a great, fun mixed media line making tool to use. Because I've used a variety of materials, I'm definitely going to have to put a clear coat on the top. And this Rust-Oleum 2x matte clear is one of my favorites to use. Well, let's take a look at what this snow gal looks like on my porch on this very warm July day. If you're new to my channel and you like doing arts and crafts, come on over and see what I'm doing. I'd love to have more creative friends join me. Leave me a thumbs up, give me a comment. It really does help my channel grow. If you enjoyed watching this little snow gal be created, here's a couple more videos you might want to check out. Well, thanks for joining me today, and hopefully you'll come back and join me again, and perhaps next time you'll create right along with me.